The diplomatic vessel, steadfast, moved through the dark between stars like a needle sliding through black silk. Commander Danny Holt stood at the observation window with his hands behind his back and watched the light of distant suns blur into pale streaks. He had made this trip before, 3 times in fact. Each time he had carried hope in one hand and patience in the other, and each time the Galactic Council had sent him home with nothing but silence and smiles that meant less than nothing. Lieutenant Megan Price stepped into the observation bay and stood beside him. She held a data tablet against her chest and waited a moment before speaking. "We are 4 hours out from Kirith Prime," she said. "The docking codes came through clean. They are expecting us." Danny nodded slowly. "They are always expecting us. That is the problem. They know exactly what we are going to say, and they have already decided to say no." She had served under Danny for 5 years. She had seen him calm during firefights and steady during negotiations that would have broken weaker people. But today there was something behind his eyes that she had not seen before. It was not anger, it was tiredness, the kind that comes not from the body, but from something deeper. "Maybe this time will be different," she said, though she did not fully believe it. Danny turned from the window. Maybe. The Galactic Council had existed for over 6,000 years. It was built on the idea that all species could live and trade together under one system of law. That was the idea. The truth was something else. The Council was run by 3 powers: the Vialthari Hegemony, the Drenok Collective, and the Solwari Enclave. Together they controlled the Jump Gate network, the trade routes, and the military doctrine that governed the entire galaxy. Every other species existed within the space these 3 allowed. Humanity had been a provisional member for 12 years. That meant they could attend sessions, file petitions, and pay tariffs, but they could not vote, could not access the inner trade corridors, and could not build military installations beyond their own solar system. They were in every way that mattered, guests in a house that charged them rent but never gave them a key. When the Steadfast docked at Kirith Prime, the station was exactly as Danny remembered it. It was enormous, a city built inside a rotating ring of white metal and glass, filled with species from 100 worlds. The air smelled faintly of ozone and something floral that Danny could never identify. Vialthari officers walked the corridors in their dark uniforms, tall and thin, with silver-gray skin and eyes like polished stone. They did not look at the humans as they passed. They never did. Danny and Megan were escorted to the council chamber, a massive circular room with tiered seating that rose in rings around a central platform. Representatives from dozens of species filled the seats. At the highest tier sat the inner circle. Torvan, the Vialthari High Arbiter, looked down from his seat with an expression that could have been carved from marble. Danny stepped onto the platform. He carried no weapons, no tricks, no threats. He carried only a petition, Earth's formal request for full membership and equal trade rights. He had rehearsed his words 100 times. He spoke clearly and simply. He listed the contributions humanity had made, the medical research shared freely with the Solwari during their plague crisis, the engineering teams loaned to the Drenok for their deep space construction projects, the tariffs paid without complaint for 12 years, totaling more than what many full members paid in 50. He finished and looked up at Torvan. The chamber was quiet. Torvan leaned forward slightly. His voice carried through the room without effort, smooth and cold. The Council thanks the human delegation for their continued enthusiasm. However, the petition for elevated status is, at this time, premature. Humanity has not yet demonstrated the civilizational maturity required for full integration. We encourage your species to continue on its current path and to resubmit in due course. There was a pause. Then Torvan added, almost as an afterthought, The galaxy has room for all species, Commander. Even its newest errand runners. A low murmur passed through the chamber. A few representatives looked uncomfortable. Most did not react at all. Danny stood on the platform and felt the weight of that word, errand runners, settle on his shoulders like a stone. He said nothing. He turned and walked off the platform. Megan followed. In the corridor outside, Megan's face was tight with anger. He said that on a live broadcast. Every human colony heard that. I know, Danny said quietly. 12 light-years away, on Earth, Admiral Karen Voss sat in a darkened briefing room and watched the broadcast end. The screen went black. She did not move for a long time. Beside her, Dr. Craig Langley, a civilian strategist who had spent 20 years studying galactic power structures, closed his notebook and set it on the table. That was worse than expected, Craig said. Karen shook her head slowly. No, that was exactly what I expected. What worries me is what comes next. You have seen the intercepts. I have. For the past 3 months, Earth's intelligence division had been picking up encrypted communications between the Valthari and the Drenok. The messages were fragmented, but the picture they painted was clear enough. The Council was not simply planning to keep humanity in its place. They were planning to tighten the leash. Colony restrictions, fleet inspections, resource audits, and something else. Something involving a frontier world called Eridon 4 that made Karen's stomach turn cold every time she read the briefing. They are not just arrogant, Craig said. They are moving pieces on a board, and they do not think we can see it. Karen stood and walked to the window. Outside, the Atlantic Ocean stretched to the horizon under a gray sky. Somewhere out there, past the clouds and the atmosphere and the cold vacuum of space, a Drenok surveillance ship had entered the Sol system 6 hours ago. It had scanned Earth's orbital defense grid. Every satellite, every weapons platform, every docked ship. And then it had left. No warning, no communication, no permission asked or given. It was not an act of war, not technically, but it was a message, and the message was simple. We can reach you whenever we want. Karen turned from the window and looked at Craig. Get me a meeting with the Joint Chiefs, tonight. Craig nodded and stood. On Kirith Prime, Danny sat alone in his quarters aboard the Steadfast. His communicator chimed. He opened the message from Earth, a short, coded report about the Drenok ship in the Sol system. He read it twice. Then he set the communicator down and stared at the wall. The petition had never mattered. He understood that now. It was never going to be heard. It was never supposed to be heard. The whole thing, the invitation, the chamber, the speech, it was all a show. A way to keep humanity looking in one direction while something else moved in the dark behind them. Danny closed his eyes. He felt the tiredness again, deeper this time. But underneath it, something else was waking up. Something old and heavy and made of iron. He did not know it yet, but every human in the galaxy was feeling the same thing at the same moment. A quiet shift. A wire pulled too tight, beginning to hum. The leash had held for 12 years. It was starting to fray. Eridon IV was not a beautiful world. It had no golden beaches or towering forests. It was a dry, wind-scraped planet with rust-colored plains and thin air that tasted like copper. But 40,000 people called it home, and they had built something real there. Farms that pulled food from stubborn soil. Schools where children learned under metal roofs that rattled when the dust storms came. Hospitals, markets, roads, all of it raised from nothing by hands that refused to stop working. Governor Nate Garza stood on the roof of the administration building and watched the sky. He had been watching it for 3 days now, ever since the ships appeared. There were 14 of them, hanging in orbit like dark teeth against the pale blue atmosphere. Thori cruisers and Dreadnought interceptors, arranged in a loose ring around the planet. A blockade. No one had told him it was coming. No declaration had been issued. No crime had been named. One morning, the ships were simply there, and every communication channel between Eridon 4 and the rest of human space went dead. Nate was not a military man. He was an engineer who had been elected governor because he was good at solving problems and better at listening to people. But this was not a problem he could solve with a wrench and a blueprint. He had tried to reach the blockade fleet through every frequency available. He had been polite, he had been firm, he had been desperate. The answer was always the same: silence. On the third day, a single transmission came through from the lead Thori cruiser. It was short and read like a legal notice. The Council had determined that Eridon 4 fell within a historical sovereignty corridor belonging to the Stori Enclave. All human activity on the planet was under review. Pending resolution, no ships would be permitted to enter or leave the system. The colonists were advised to remain calm and cooperate. Nate read the message 3 times. Then he set his tablet down and pressed his palms flat against the table to stop them from shaking. The Stori had abandoned this system 400 years before humanity even discovered faster-than-light travel. There was nothing here that belonged to them. Everyone knew it. The claim was a lie, and it was not even a clever one. But it did not need to be clever. It only needed to be official. Supplies began to run thin within 2 weeks. Eridon 4 was not self-sufficient. It relied on regular cargo shipments for medical equipment, machine parts, and certain nutrients that the local soil could not produce. The farms could feed the population for a while, but the hospitals were already rationing antibiotics, and 2 of the colony's water purifiers had failed, with no replacement parts available. Sergeant Lisa Dunn was the highest-ranking military officer on the planet, which was not saying much. She commanded a garrison of 46 soldiers whose primary job until now had been wildlife control and emergency response. They were not a fighting force. They were a maintenance crew with uniforms. But Lisa had served in Earth's outer fleet before transferring to colonial duty, and she knew what a blockade meant. It meant someone wanted something, and they were willing to let people suffer until they got it. She organized the garrison into shifts: perimeter watch, supply management, and civilian support. She moved weapons from the armory to secure locations around the colony, in case things got worse. And she started working on something that Nate did not know about. In the basement of the colony's original landing module, a structure that had been converted into a storage building years ago, there was a decommissioned, long-range transmitter. It was old, heavy, and had been stripped of several key components. Lisa spent every night down there with a soldering iron and a stolen engineering manual, rebuilding it piece by piece. She knew it would only be able to send 1 burst before the blockade fleet detected the signal and jammed it. 1 chance. She worked quietly and told no one except her most trusted corporal, a young man named Andy Reeves. Andy did not ask questions. He just held the flashlight and handed her tools when she asked for them. On the 18th day, a child in the eastern settlement died from an infection that could have been treated with basic antibiotics. The colony had run out 4 days earlier. Nate stood at the small funeral and looked at the faces around him. Parents holding their children closer. Old men and women who had crossed the galaxy to build a new life and were now watching it crumble. He felt something shift inside him. It was not grief. It was not fear. It was a hard, cold knot of understanding. The Council was not going to stop. There was no review. There was no resolution coming. This was the plan. Starve them. Break them. Take the planet. Nate found Lisa that evening. She was covered in grease and solder burns, and she looked like she had not slept in days. She showed him the transmitter. It was ugly and held together with scavenged wire, but she said it would work. One shot, she said. I can get a signal to the nearest relay station. From there, it will bounce to Earth. It will be broken up and full of noise, but if they are listening, they will hear it. Nate looked at the machine, and then at Lisa. Send it. The signal left Eridan 4 at the speed of light, punching through the blockade's jamming field for exactly 1.4 seconds before being crushed. It was a fragment, broken, distorted, barely coherent, but it contained three things: the colony's identification code, the word blockade, and a string of coordinates. It was enough. Far away, on Quirith Prime, things had gone from bad to worse. Danny Holt had been arrested. The charges were espionage, specifically that he had attempted to access restricted Council military databases. It was a lie. Danny had done nothing of the kind, and everyone involved knew it. But the charges gave the Vialthari legal authority to hold him in a detention cell aboard the station. And that was the point. Remove the human ambassador. Cut off the voice. Megan Price was not arrested, but she knew it was only a matter of time. She moved through the station carefully, staying in public areas where surveillance was heavy and detention would draw attention. She was looking for a way out, a ship, a shuttle, anything that could get her off the station and back to human space. She found help where she least expected it. A Solwari administrative clerk named Aelith approached her in the station's lower market. Aelith was small, even by Solwari standards, with pale green skin and wide dark eyes that moved constantly. She spoke in a whisper. I know what they are doing to your colony, Aelith said. Many of my people know. We did not agree to this. The blockade was the Vialthari's idea. They want the mineral deposits beneath your colony's northern ridge. The Solwari enclave was pressured into lending the legal claim, but it was never ours to give. Megan stared at her. Why are you telling me this? Because it is wrong, Aelith said simply. And because if your people fall, mine will be next. The Vialthari do not share power. They collect it. Aelith helped Megan reach a maintenance shuttle in the station's lower docking ring. It was small, slow, and had no weapons, but it had a working faster-than-light drive. Megan climbed in and looked back at Aelith standing in the doorway. Come with me, Megan said. Aelith shook her head. I am more useful here. Go, tell your people what is happening. Tell them the truth. Megan launched the shuttle and disappeared into the dark. On Earth, the distress signal from Eridan 4 arrived at Fleet Command at 3 in the morning. It was decoded, cleaned, and placed on Admiral Karen Voss's desk within the hour. She read it standing up. Then she read it again. Craig Langley arrived minutes later. He found Karen standing at her desk with both hands flat on the surface, the decoded signal glowing on the screen in front of her. She looked up at him, and he saw something in her face that he had never seen before. It was not anger. It was certainty. They blockaded Eridan 4, she said. 40,000 civilians. No warning. No cause. Children are dying. Craig said nothing. There was nothing to say. Karen straightened up. She pressed a button on her desk, and a light turned red, the silent alert code for full fleet readiness. Every human warship in the solar system and beyond would begin quiet preparations within the hour. No announcements, no broadcasts, no warnings. She looked at Craig with eyes that were dry and steady, and utterly without mercy. They did not just cross the line, she said. They erased it. For 3 weeks, humanity went silent. Every diplomatic channel closed. Every trade ship returned to port. Every human voice in the galaxy simply stopped speaking. It was as if an entire species had taken a breath and held it. The galaxy noticed. On Quirith Prime, the corridors that had once carried the sound of human traders and diplomats were empty. The docking bays where human cargo ships had loaded and unloaded goods every day were dark and still. At first, the Council treated it as a tantrum. the Veilthari High Arbiter, Torvon, made a public statement calling the silence a predictable emotional response from a young species still learning the cost of ambition. The Dreadnought Collective issued a brief comment suggesting that humanity had finally accepted its place. But as the days passed, the tone changed. Intelligence officers across 3 empires began filing reports that said the same thing. They could not find the humans. Not their ships. Not their signals. Not their movements. It was as if someone had pulled a curtain across an entire civilization. Surveillance probes sent toward the Sol system returned empty data. The relay stations that normally carried human communications were active, but transmitting nothing. The silence was not the silence of surrender. It was the silence of something being built. Admiral Karen Voss had not slept more than 4 hours a night since the blockade report. She did not need to. The plan she was executing had been in preparation for years, hidden inside budgets labeled as mining operations, research projects, and infrastructure maintenance. It was called Operation Burning Dawn, and it was the reason humanity had smiled and paid its tariffs and bowed its head for 12 long years. The truth was simple and terrible. From the moment Earth joined the Council, Karen and a small circle of military and civilian leaders had understood what the galaxy really was. It was not a community. It was a hierarchy enforced by the threat of force. And the only way to survive in it was to be strong enough that no one would dare test you. So while humanity played the role of the obedient newcomer, its shipyards worked in silence. They were built in places no one would think to look. Inside hollowed-out asteroids in the Kuiper Belt. Behind the radiation storms of Jupiter's upper atmosphere. In deep orbital slots around Neptune, where the cold and the dark hid everything. For 12 years, these yards had been producing warships. Not the small patrol vessels the Council knew about, but heavy assault carriers, stealth frigates, and electronic warfare platforms designed from the ground up to fight and win against Council technology. Captain Kyle Patton stood on the bridge of the assault carrier Iron Wake and watched his crew prepare for launch. Kyle was 38 years old, broad-shouldered, and had a face that looked like it had been designed for exactly this kind of moment. Hard, focused, and completely without doubt. He had spent his career training for a war that everyone hoped would never come. Now it was here, and he felt nothing but a cold, clean readiness. His strike group consisted of the Iron Wake, 4 destroyer escorts, and a single stealth frigate, the Grey Veil, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Becky Nolan. Becky was the opposite of Kyle in almost every way. She was small, quiet, and had the kind of face that people forgot 10 minutes after meeting her. That was useful in her line of work. The Grey Veil was an electronic warfare ship, designed to blind, confuse, and cripple enemy sensor networks. Becky had written half of its combat software herself, and she trusted it the way a surgeon trusts a scalpel. Break the blockade at Eridan IV. Rescue the colonists. Demonstrate capability. Do not fire first, but if fired upon, end it fast. Karen delivered the final order from Earth via an encrypted burst that would take 6 hours to reach the strike group. It contained only 2 words: go loud. Kyle read the message and passed it to his first officer. Then he addressed his crew over the ship-wide channel. He did not give a speech. He said only this: we have people out there who need to come home. Let us go get them. The strike group launched from behind Neptune's shadow and entered faster than light travel in formation. The journey to Eridan IV would take 11 hours. 11 hours in which Kyle sat in his command chair and went over every detail of the plan one more time, and then one more time after that. Becky spent those hours in the Grey Veil's Combat Information Center, surrounded by screens that showed the electronic signature of every known Council warship. She had studied these signatures for years. She knew their sensor frequencies, their communication protocols, their blind spots. She knew exactly how long it would take to shut each one down, and she had practiced it so many times in simulation that her hands moved across the controls from memory alone. The blockade fleet at Eridan 4 had grown comfortable. They had been sitting in orbit for over 3 weeks, with no resistance and no sign of a response. The Veilthari commander, a career officer who had never fought a battle against an opponent that could fight back, had reduced his patrol rotations and allowed 2 of his ships to enter low-power mode to conserve fuel. The Dreadnought flagship sat at the center of the formation, like a fat spider in a web, confident that nothing in human space could challenge it. They were wrong. The gray veil dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the extreme edge of the system, far beyond the blockade's sensor range. Becky's team went to work immediately. They launched a spread of electronic warfare drones, small, quiet devices that drifted toward the blockade fleet like seeds carried on a wind. Each drone carried a precisely tuned signal package designed to overload a specific sensor array on a specific ship. At exactly the planned moment, Becky pressed one button, and every drone activated at once. The blockade fleet went blind, sensors filled with noise, communication channels collapsed into static, targeting systems spun uselessly, searching for contacts that were everywhere and nowhere. The Veilthari commander shouted orders that no one could hear. The Dreadnought flagship tried to reboot its systems and found that the interference was not just jamming, it was actively rewriting the ship's sensor software, feeding it false data that made empty space look full of threats. And then the Iron Wake arrived. Kyle's carrier group dropped out of faster-than-light travel inside the blockade perimeter. Not near it, inside it. The maneuver required a precision of calculation that Council navigation officers considered theoretically impossible. You could not drop a fleet inside an existing formation without risking collision, sensor overlap, and a dozen other problems that made it suicidal. But human navigators had been practicing this exact maneuver for 3 years in secret, and they executed it perfectly. The Iron Wake appeared less than 800 meters from the Veilthari command cruiser. The destroyer escorts materialized in a ring around the Dreadnought flagship. 2 fleets, face to face, close enough to see each other's hull markings through a window. Kyle opened a channel. His voice was calm and carried no anger. "This is Captain Kyle Patton of the Earth assault carrier, Iron Wake. You are maintaining an illegal blockade of a human colony. You will power down your weapons and withdraw from this system immediately. You have 60 seconds. 43 seconds passed. Then the Veilthari command cruiser powered up its forward guns. Kyle did not hesitate. All ships, weapons free. The battle lasted 4 hours, but it was decided in the first 10 minutes. The Council ships were blind, disorganized, and outmatched. Human weapons were faster, more accurate, and hit harder than anything the blockade fleet had expected. The Veilthari command cruiser took a precision strike to its engine section and went dark. One by one, the other cruisers were disabled. Not destroyed, but crippled, left drifting with their weapons fused and their engines dead. Kyle had ordered his crews to aim for systems, not for lives. The goal was not slaughter. It was a message. The Dreadnought flagship, surrounded and blind, surrendered after 2 hours. Its captain transmitted a single word on an open frequency: enough. On the surface of Eridan 4, Lisa Dunn stood in the colony square and watched the sky change. The dark shapes that had hung over them for weeks were gone, replaced by the clean, sharp silhouettes of human warships descending through the atmosphere. Dropships landed in the square, one after another, and soldiers in Earth uniforms stepped out carrying medical supplies, food, and water. Nate Garza stood beside Lisa. He tried to speak, and could not. He put one hand over his face, and his shoulders shook. Lisa put a hand on his arm, and said nothing. There was nothing that needed to be said. 8,000 light-years away, On Kirith Prime, Danny Holt's cell door opened. No guard came to release him. The corridor outside was empty. He walked out slowly, half expecting a trap, but there was none. The guards had simply left. He found a terminal and sent a single message to the council chamber. "We would like to revisit our petition." The news spread across the galaxy like fire through dry grass. A provisional species, the humans, the errand runners, the quiet ones who paid their tariffs and bowed their heads, had broken a council blockade by force. 12 Veilthari warships disabled, a Dreadnought flagship captured intact, 0 human ships lost. The battle footage, leaked by sources no one could trace, played on every station and every world. Species that had never paid attention to humanity before were now watching very carefully. On Kirith Prime, the council chamber erupted into chaos. Emergency sessions were called 3 times in 2 days. Representatives shouted over each other in languages that the translation system struggled to keep up with. The Veilthari delegation demanded an immediate military response, a full combined fleet sent to the Sol system to, as they put it, correct the human aberration. Torvald stood at his podium and called the attack on the blockade an act of war against the council itself, a violation of every treaty humanity had signed, and proof that the species was too dangerous to be allowed independence. But the response he expected did not come. The military commanders of the Veilthari fleet had seen the battle footage. They had studied the sensor data recovered from the surviving ships, and what they found made them hesitate. The human weapons had been precise to a degree that should not have been possible. Their ships had executed maneuvers that Veilthari navigation theory said could not be done. Their electronic warfare capabilities had turned a 14-ship blockade into a blind, helpless mess in under 60 seconds. The Veilthari admirals were not afraid of a fight, but they were afraid of a fight they might lose, and for the first time in centuries, that possibility was real. The Dreadnought Collective was even less eager. Their flagship had been captured, and with it, every piece of classified technology and intelligence aboard. The Dreadnought Military Council was more concerned with what the humans now knew about their systems than with launching a counterattack. They issued a careful public statement calling for measured dialogue, and privately began repositioning their home fleet to a defensive posture. Admiral Karen Voss had expected all of this. The strike on the blockade was only the first move. The second was already in motion. The Earth's Second Fleet, under the command of Captain Amy Shelton, moved to a position near the Dreadnought homeworld's outer jump gate. Amy was a small woman with short dark hair and a reputation for saying very little and meaning every word of it. Her destroyer, the Pale Horse, held station at the gate with its weapons powered down and its running lights on full. Visible, unthreatening, and impossible to ignore. She was not there to fight. She was there to be seen. A reminder that humanity could reach the Dreadnought doorstep any time it chose. The Third Fleet, commanded by Commander Derek Falk, took a similar position at the Solwari Trade Nexus, the single most important commercial hub in Solwari space. Derek was older than most ship commanders, gray at the temples, and calm in a way that made people around him feel both safe and slightly nervous. His cruiser group sat at the edge of the Nexus and did nothing. They answered no hails. They made no demands. They simply existed, and their existence changed the mathematics of every strategic calculation the Solwari were making. Karen watched the fleet positions update on her display and allowed herself a small nod. The galaxy was used to species that either submitted or attacked. Humanity was doing something different. It was demonstrating reach, showing every council member that the old assumptions about human capability were wrong, and letting them sit with that knowledge. Now came the harder part. Craig Langley arrived at Kirith Prime aboard a civilian transport, dressed in a plain gray suit and carrying a single briefcase. He was Earth's new chief negotiator, though he would have been the first to admit he did not look like one. Craig was 52, thin, and had the kind of face that looked permanently tired. He spoke softly and moved slowly, and had a habit of looking at people for a very long time before responding to anything they said. Diplomats who had underestimated him once rarely made the mistake again. He was met at the docking bay by Danny Holt, who had been released from detention without ceremony or apology. Danny looked thinner than when Craig had last seen him, but his eyes were sharp. "Welcome to Quireth Prime," Danny said with a dry smile. "Try not to get arrested." Craig smiled back. "No promises." They walked together to the human delegation's quarters, a set of modest rooms in one of the station's lower rings. On the way, Craig noticed something interesting. Species that had once ignored humans in the corridors now stepped aside as they passed. Some nodded. A few stared openly, not with hostility, but with something closer to curiosity, or perhaps reassessment. "They are afraid," Danny said, reading his expression. "Good," Craig replied. "Afraid people listen." The next day, Craig requested a formal audience with the full council. He was granted one within hours, something that would have taken months under normal circumstances. He entered the chamber alone, carrying his briefcase, and stood on the central platform where Danny had stood weeks earlier with his ignored petition. Craig did not open with a speech. He opened the briefcase and placed a single data tablet on the podium. Then he looked up at the tiered seats and spoke. "This document contains a complete record of every treaty violation, every illegal tariff, every manipulated vote, and every act of economic exploitation committed by council members against humanity over the past 12 years. It is organized by date, by species, and by estimated financial impact. I am not presenting it as a grievance. I am presenting it as an invoice." The chamber went very quiet. Craig continued. "Earth does not want war. We have demonstrated that we are capable of it, and we hope that demonstration is sufficient. What we want is what we have always wanted: a seat at the table, fair trade, and the right to protect our people without asking permission from those who have shown they do not have our interests in mind." He paused and looked directly at Torvan. "We are also prepared to discuss the return of the captured Drenok flagship and its contents. In exchange for certain considerations, of course." Torvan's expression did not change, but his hands tightened on the arms of his chair. The negotiations that followed were unlike anything the council had experienced. Craig was patient, thorough, and utterly unimpressed by tradition. When the Vilethari invoked ancient precedent, he cited specific cases where that precedent had been selectively ignored. When the Drenok raised security concerns, he reminded them that their flagship was currently parked in a human docking bay. When anyone raised their voice, Craig lowered his. But the real shift came from the Solwari. Aelith, the young clerk who had helped Megan escape Quireth Prime, had not been idle. In the weeks since the blockade, she had become something she never intended to be: a political voice. She had shared the truth about the Velthari's manipulation of the Solwari sovereignty claim with her own government, and the reaction had been fierce. The Solwari public, already uneasy about their alliance with the Velthari, turned sharply against the blockade. Protests broke out on 3 Solwari worlds. The Enclave's ruling council fractured into factions, and the faction that wanted distance from the Velthari grew louder by the day. When the Solwari representatives stood in the council chamber and announced that the Enclave was formally withdrawing its support for the Velthari position and opening independent negotiations with Earth, the rune fell into stunned silence. It was the first time in living memory that a member of the inner circle had broken rank during an active dispute. Torvan watched it happen and said nothing. But behind his carved expression, something was moving. That evening, he activated a dormant clause in council law, Article 17, the Pacification Doctrine. It authorized the Council to assemble a combined fleet to subdue any species deemed a threat to galactic stability. It had not been used in over 2,000 years, but it was still on the books, and Torvon intended to use it. The vote went to the chamber floor the next morning. Torvon stood and made his case. Humanity was dangerous. Humanity was unpredictable. Humanity had attacked Council forces without provocation. He did not mention the blockade, and must be contained before the situation grew worse. The chamber voted. The motion failed. Not by a slim margin, but decisively. The smaller species, the ones who had watched the humans and seen something familiar in their struggle, voted against it. Even 2 Drenok representatives broke with their own delegation and voted no. Torvon stood at his podium and looked out at the chamber that had once obeyed his every word. For the first time, no one was looking at him. They were looking at Craig Langley, who stood on the lower platform with his hands in his pockets and a tired expression on his face. Craig caught Danny's eye across the room and gave a small nod. Danny nodded back. It was not over, but the ground had shifted, and everyone in the room could feel it. The old order was cracking, and through the cracks, something new was starting to push its way into the light. 6 months passed, and the galaxy learned to say the word human differently. It was no longer spoken with pity or amusement or the casual dismissal that had followed the species for over a decade. Now it was spoken carefully, the way one speaks the name of something that has proven it can bite. The formal treaty negotiations took 3 months. Craig Langley led the human delegation with the same quiet patience he had shown in the council chamber. He did not gloat. He did not threaten. He simply laid out the terms and waited for the galaxy to catch up with what had already changed. Earth would receive full council membership with complete voting rights and access to all trade corridors and jump gate systems. Human colonies would be recognized as sovereign territory under the same protections afforded to any full member species. The tribute tariffs would end, and there would be an accounting. Not a punishment, but a transparent review of every decision the Council had made regarding humanity, conducted by an independent body with representatives from 12 species. The Velthari resisted every point, but they were negotiating from a position they had never occupied before. Weakness. Their military was intact, but shaken. Their alliance with the Drenok had fractured over the captured flagship, which Earth returned in a gesture of goodwill that cost them nothing and earned them a great deal. The Drenok, grateful and pragmatic, quietly signed a bilateral trade agreement with Earth before the Council Treaty was even finalized. The message to the Velthari was clear. The old alliances were done. The Solwari Enclave went further, under pressure from its own citizens and guided by the growing influence of voices like Aleph. The Enclave became Earth's most vocal supporter in the Council. Aleph herself had risen from anonymous clerk to something approaching a public figure. She did not hold an official title, but when she spoke, Solwari politicians listened. She had paid a price for her actions. Her family had been pressured. Her career within the administrative system effectively ended. But she carried herself with a quiet steadiness that reminded Danny of someone he knew well. Danny Holt was appointed as Earth's first permanent ambassador to Kirith Prime. The posting came with a proper office on the station's upper ring, the same level where the Velthari and Drenok delegations had their chambers. Danny stood in the empty room on his first day and looked out through the wide window at the stars. Megan Price, now his senior advisor, stood behind him. 12 years, she said. 12 years of sitting in the lower ring and being told to wait our turn. Danny touched the glass with his fingertips. I remember. How does it feel? He thought about it for a long time. It feels like the beginning of a lot of hard work. Megan smiled. She had expected him to say something like that. Their first official act was to propose what would become known as the Eridan Accords, a new legal framework governing the treatment of provisional species within the Council. The Accords guaranteed that no provisional member could be blockaded, sanctioned, or denied basic trade rights without a full Council vote and a 60-day review period. They established an independent advocacy office where new species can report abuses without going through the inner circle. And they created a mutual defense clause that required full members to respond if a provisional member's territory was threatened. It was, in every way, the protection that humanity had never been given. Danny presented it to the Council not as a human demand, but as a gift, a system that would make the galaxy fairer for everyone who came after them. Several species that had quietly suffered under the old system for centuries endorsed it within days. The Accords passed with the largest majority vote in Council history. On Earth, Admiral Karen Voss retired from active command. She was 61 years old, and she had spent the last 20 of those years carrying a secret that weighed more than any ship in her fleet. She had built a war machine in the dark, knowing that if it was ever discovered before it was needed, it would be destroyed, and humanity would be defenseless. She had smiled at Council inspectors while standing 10 feet above a hidden weapons bay. She had signed budgets that disguised battleship construction as asteroid mining equipment. She had done all of it because she believed it was necessary, but being right did not make the weight any lighter. She took a small house on the coast of Maine and spent her first week of retirement sitting on the porch, watching the ocean, and saying nothing to anyone. Craig visited her on the 8th day. He brought coffee and sat beside her. "You saved 40,000 people on Eridan 4, he said. "Probably a lot more than that, in the long run." Karen took a sip of coffee. "I know." "How does it feel?" he asked. She looked at him. "It feels like I can finally sleep." Kyle Patton was promoted to Rear Admiral and given command of Earth's new Outer Fleet Division, the force responsible for maintaining human presence in deep space. He accepted the promotion with a handshake and a short speech that his officers later agreed was the most Kyle Patton thing they had ever heard. He said, "Good. Let us get back to work." Becky Nolan was given command of her own stealth wing, a squadron of electronic warfare ships that would serve as Earth's eyes and ears in contested space. She named the wing Gray Flight and personally selected every officer in it. She was not interested in fame or recognition. She was interested in making sure that what happened at Eridan 4 could never happen again. Lisa Dunn received a commendation from Earth's Joint Military Command for her actions during the blockade. They offered her a promotion and a transfer to any posting she wanted. She chose to stay on Eridan 4. The colony needed a security chief, and Lisa had decided that the planet she had fought to save was the planet where she belonged. Nate Garza shook her hand the day she accepted the position and told her the colony would not be here without her. Lisa shrugged and said she just fixed a radio. Andy Reeves, the corporal who had held the flashlight while she rebuilt the transmitter, was promoted to sergeant. He still did not ask many questions, and Lisa still appreciated that about him. The colony rebuilt. The northern ridge, where the mineral deposits lay that the vile Thari had wanted badly enough to blockade a planet, was developed by a human Solwari joint mining venture. The profits went to the colony and to the Solwari communities that had spoken out against the blockade. It was not a perfect arrangement, but it was a fair one, and on Eridan 4, fair was enough. In a quiet corridor on Kireth Prime, Craig Langley sat across from Danny Holt in a small room with no windows. They were drinking something that the Solwari called tea, but tasted more like warm grass. It was late, and the station's lights had dimmed to their night cycle. They had been talking for hours about policy, about the Accords, about the 100 small fires that still needed to be put out across human space. But eventually the conversation turned, as it always did, to the thing neither of them liked to talk about directly. They made a mistake, Craig said. A classic one. They mistook restraint for weakness. They saw us bowing our heads and assumed we were broken. They never considered the possibility that we were choosing to be patient. Danny nodded. That is true, but it nearly was weakness. You know that. There were people who wanted to accept it. People who said we should be grateful for what we had. People who were tired of fighting for a place at a table that did not want us. Craig looked at him. And what changed their minds? Danny stared into his cup. Eridan 4. A child died because we did not have antibiotics. That is what changed their minds. Not strategy, not pride. A child. They sat in silence for a while. The hardest part was not fighting back, Danny said finally. The hardest part was deciding to. On the far side of the station, in a small chamber stripped of its decorations and its authority, Torvald sat alone. He had been removed from his position as High Arbiter. Not dramatically. There had been no trial, no public shaming. His own people had simply stopped returning his calls, and one morning he arrived at his office to find the locks changed. The Veilthari were practical above all else. A leader who had miscalculated this badly was not punished. He was forgotten. He sat in the dark and watched a broadcast of the Eridan Accord signing ceremony. Danny Holt stood at the podium, flanked by Megan and Craig, and representatives from a dozen species. The camera showed Aelith in the Solwari delegation, her dark eyes shining. It showed Kyle Patton in his new admiral's uniform, standing straight and still. It showed Becky Nolan near the back of the room, already looking at her tablet, probably running diagnostics on something. A young Veilthari aide entered the chamber and stood uncertainly near the door. She had been assigned to Torvald out of obligation, not respect, and she was not sure how to behave around a figure who had once commanded empires, and now commanded an empty room. "Sir," she said quietly, "what went wrong?" Torvald did not look away from the screen. He watched the humans sign the document and shake hands and do all the small, ordinary things that species do when they have won something worth winning. He was quiet for a long time. "We assumed they were like us," he said. "They are not. When we are pushed, we push back. It is simple. It is immediate. It is what every species in this galaxy does." He paused. "When they are pushed, they do not push back. They remember. And, by the time you realize what they have built, it is already too late." The aide said nothing. She looked at the screen, and then back at Torvald, and then quietly left the room. Torvald sat alone in the dark, and watched the ceremony end. The broadcast cut to an image of Earth, its orbital ring gleaming in the sunlight, bright and growing, studded with docking ports and construction frames, and the shapes of ships being born. It was open, visible, and no longer hidden, a ring of steel and light that said, plainly and without apology, that humanity was here, and humanity was staying. The camera held on the image for a long time, before the screen went black.